a large part of what today's talk is going to be about is this relationship of anatomy in terms of what we see in art and how that shifts and changes, and anatomy in terms of medicine, how that is really the foundation for understanding the body.
Ever wonder why so many Greek statues are naked? Is it about beauty, desire, or something else entirely? Bodies are a subject of fascination in art, whether decked out in status symbols or wearing nothing at all. And there's a good reason why. All through the ages, many of our most famous artworks have featured the human form. Despite our many differences, we all have a body, but we don't all experience it the same way. And there are competing ideas about what makes a body beautiful. On top of that, our notions of beauty and difference have changed and continue to change over time. And all of that makes for some fascinating art. Think about bodies and art. One of the first things that comes to mind might be the portrait. From the Mona Lisa to that selfie from your recent trip, portraits are a record of a body at a particular moment in time. But portraits can show us a lot more about a person than just what they looked like. They can tell us about a person's class status, values, character, and social influence. These details aren't always obvious, though. Like with any artistic representation, it helps to know what symbols to look out for. For example, a subject's clothes can tell us a lot. Like these ancestor portraits, created during China's Qing dynasty in the 18th century, were commissioned by wealthy families to showcase their lineage and status. Hung on the walls of homes, the portraits honored departed loved ones, allowing them to be remembered by family, friends, and guests. Shi Wenying and Lady Guan's style of dress shows the viewer where they sit on the social ladder. Shi Wenying was a lieutenant general in the military, which the artist communicates with the peacock feather and fur coat. These are symbols that people of the Qing dynasty who valued military service, wealth, and power would have respected. In Lady Guan's portrait, she dons a full-length courtly dress, which was only worn by high-ranking officials and nobles. And note the 3 earrings. They identify Guan as a Manchu woman, part of the lineage that established the Qing dynasty. Though they didn't have filters or Photoshop like we do now, portraits have always contained some embellishments on the truth. For example, the artist never actually saw Lady Guan in person. It wasn't considered proper for women of the time to keep company with unfamiliar men. The artist relied on other people's verbal descriptions of her face. So the portrait is an idealized version of her, based more on imagination than observation. But portraits are never really real or truthful anyway. That's because they freeze a body's appearance at a moment in time, when in reality we're always changing, both because we age and also because we're always being seen from different perspectives, by others and by ourselves. American artist Cindy Sherman has captured the fluidity of identity in her work over the last several decades, including in her 1970s series, Untitled Film Stills. In it, she dressed and posed herself in a variety of portraits that reference stereotypical female characters in films. In one, she's a housewife standing over the kitchen sink. In another, she's tangled in the sheets, gazing wistfully off camera. Next, she's a student reaching for a library book, or a fashionable woman walking down a city street. Each image could be read in numerous ways, depending on your background, generation, or just which movies you've seen. In this way, Sherman turns her body into a blank canvas, reflecting society's many and often contradictory expectations of women. Her work reminds us that how we see ourselves and how society sees us is always changing. Of course, not all bodies in art are clothed. Some of the most famous ones are decidedly not. This goes way back to classical Greek and Roman sculpture, which celebrated the nude figure as the pinnacle of beauty. And because art students during the Renaissance and beyond studied these classics, European art from the 15th to the 20th century has no shortage of nude bodies, who can be found reclining on beds, clouds, and even on satyrs. Classical male nudes exhibited perfect athletic forms, embodying strength, beauty, and determination, the ideal masculine figure. Of course, most ancient Greeks didn't actually look like this. In general, this look was about aspiration and admiration, not reality. And men in these cultures weren't just valued for their physical prowess. Their chiseled bods were also considered to be a sign of moral superiority. Male nudes were typically shown confidently, with weapons and, tough guy stuff. Female nudes, on the other hand, were usually representations of sensuality and fertility. At the same time, they had to demonstrate modesty. Here you can see how Aphrodite covers herself and averts her gaze. So while the male nude could be loud and proud, the female nude generally exhibited some shame, an age-old trope that we're totally over now, right? In any case, the way we look at and interpret a subject in art, especially a human subject, changes based on the power dynamics between the viewer and the thing being viewed. In art history, we refer to this dynamic as the gaze. So, since pretty much all artists in classical Greek and Roman cultures were men, they were often imagined as the default audience for art. Men were the ones looking or gazing at art, and women were the objects to be gazed at. You can see this perspective in how nudes are typically posed. Female nudes tend to lie helpless and passive, inviting the viewer to look at and maybe lust after them. Whereas male nudes are given a place of equal or often higher footing relative to the viewer. We gaze up at their greatness and watch them mid-action, while female nudes are more static and generally below the level of male figures. Sadly, this is not a relic of the past, which is why you might hear the phrase the male gaze being thrown about in cultural conversation. And it's also why Captain America poses like this, and Black Widow poses like this. Of course, in art history, as in life, males don't always desire females, and females don't always want to be desired by males. There's an entire spectrum of gender and sexuality that is occasionally, if infrequently, reflected in art. Like we know that there were lots of Greek and Roman sculptures featuring the intersex figure of Hermaphroditus, child of the gods Aphrodite and Hermes. But these sculptures have frequently been left out of the conversation because they don't conform to traditional ideas about gender and heterosexual desire. Thankfully, artists have been challenging these dynamics for decades.
Manet's Olympia, I always feel like there's this relationship of people all dressed up and stuffy going to museums to then stand there in this fancy clothes looking at a bunch of naked people. This is what I really like about Manet. He has the luncheon on the grass where there's this woman that's happily lounging completely nude, and she's having lunch with these guys that are all dressed in their top coats, which is a great irony that he's pointing to. So one of the things I want to talk about is a link between the ancient Greek, Roman to the Renaissance is this naturalism. For example, very much about telling a story. It's not about the figure. If anything, the figure is to literally read. It's not about the person or the figure or the way they look. It's about what they represent or what they symbolize. So there's something else that was there, but there is naturalism that started peeking out, and we see that transition happen in the ancient Greek, and then it gets picked up again in the Renaissance. And a big part of that had to do with contrapposto, something that's very traditional, very classic in a lot of art, but this is one of those things that took a turn towards more natural figures, more naturalism. There's a certain way that you stand that is more comfortable, and that is what is referred to as contrapposto. I'll let them run through this smart history, which I think is a short, good video.
We're in the Archaeological Museum in Florence, looking at a life-size male nude figure in bronze.
Now, we both saw this from down the hallway and thought immediately about contrapposto, the Greek invention in the 5th century BCE, a way of naturalistically representing the human body, a real revolution in Western art.
When we stand naturally in a relaxed pose, pose, we tend to stand with our weight on one leg or the other. In fact, if we stand for an extended period of time, we tend to shift our weight from one leg to the other every few minutes. It helps to rest the body.
Nevertheless, when the Greeks before this, or the Egyptians, represented the human body, they represented the figure standing with their weight equally distributed on both legs, making the figure appear very symmetrical, a way that you very rarely see human beings in the world.
I don't stand like that, and it's actually quite uncomfortable.
I'm not standing like that right now.
But to represent a figure with weight on one leg is a much more complex endeavor because the entire body responds. Contrapposto affects not only the legs, but the torso, and to some extent even potentially the shoulders and the head.
The ultimate effect is a revolutionary one because it creates a figure who seems to exist in our world by breaking the symmetry of the archaic Greek figures, of Egyptian pharaohs. By breaking that symmetry, we get a sense of a figure who exists in our own world, a figure who is human like us.
What I'm seeing first is a kind of S-curve in his spine so that the hips seem to jut out to his right and his rib cage seems to push to his left.
And because his weight is on his right leg, his left side is more elongated because his left leg is relaxed, pulling that hip down, and his right torso is compacted.
And you can see that very clearly if you look at the shift in the axis of the hips. It also allows for that sway not only in his body, but in his spine as well.
And then he looks in the direction of the swayed hip. We also notice while his right leg is straight, his left arm is straight, and his right hand opens up toward us. In other examples of sculptures like this from classical Greece, for example, Polykleitos' Doryphorus, that hand often held a spear. So you have the weight-bearing hand on the right and the weight-bearing leg on the right, the free leg on the left, and the free hand on the left.
And this affects the shoulders as well. If his right hip juts upward, his left shoulder falls down towards it. And so they're in opposition. And the same is true on the other side. On his left, his hip falls and his shoulder rises.
The Greek invention of contrapposto in the 5th century BCE tells us that the Greeks have a different way of thinking about human beings and their place in the world. This first naturalistic image of humanity, of human beings in the West, gives us a sense that the Greeks have a confidence in human beings, in the human mind, in human reason, and we see that through their philosophy, through their love of athleticism, through their invention of the Olympics, their study of the heavens, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the great Greek comedies and tragedies. The confidence of Greek culture in humanity, I think, is expressed in contrapposto.
And this sculpture, because it's not actually Greek, but Roman, a Roman copy of these Greek principles, shows us the influence of these ideas, the way that the ancient Romans emulated the Greeks, saw themselves as the inheritor of this tradition, and it is through the Romans that these ideas come down to us today.
And then are revived in the Renaissance. And here we are in Renaissance Florence, where sculptures like this one were rediscovered, were collected, and artists like Donatello, Nanni di Banco, ultimately Michelangelo, and Raphael in his paintings will create figures that look back to ancient Greek and Roman sculpture and the tremendous naturalism that the ancient Greeks and Romans achieved.
Ancient Greek sculptures, bronze or marble, are frozen, but that doesn't mean that the ancient Greeks didn't want to convey movement.
In this case, movement that you couldn't even see with the naked eye.
What we're looking at is a sculpture by an artist whose name is Myron. We've lost his original, but we have a later Roman marble copy of the discus thrower.
The original was in bronze from the 5th century BCE.
About 450, 460.
And what we're looking at is one of many Roman copies. In fact, there's one next to the other in this museum, a testament to how popular these were among the Romans.
This sculpture shows a man who is at that moment where his body is fully wound. Look at the way that his right leg is bearing the weight of his body. His left leg, the toes are bent under, dragging slightly, and he's about to throw that discus. There's this moment of a tremendous tension, but it's also this moment of stasis, stillness, right before the action.
Athletes and art historians have debated whether this is even an actual pose that the discus thrower takes in the process.
It's so interesting because when we think back about the history of the Greek figure, we think first of the archaic Koros, who is so stiff and so stylized. And then we have the tremendous breakthroughs of people like Polykleitos, who develop an understanding of the body and show it in contrapposto. But here we have something that's so dynamic and so complex. I mean, just look at the arc of the shoulders and the arms and the way that they reverse the arc of the twist of the hips.
That is the overriding concern of Myron, the sculptor, to capture the aesthetic qualities here, the sense of balance and harmony and the beauty in the proportions of the body.
There is a kind of anti-realism here for all of its careful naturalism. There is no real strain within the body. It is absolutely at rest and ideal, even in this extreme pose.
If you think about a figure from much later, but in a similar pose of movement, of athletic energy, like Bernini's David,
Well, that's got all this torsion, absolutely.
that figure expresses all of the physical power in the face. He's clenching his teeth, right?
It's true, and his brow is really knit forward. But here, the face is absolutely serene, and it reminds me of the consistency with which the Greeks always maintain their nobility, even in battle, even in terrible situations with monsters, and here, even at this moment when he's about to release the discus.
Right, that nobility, that calm in the face is a sign of a nobility of the human being.
Well, this is a sport, and the man is naked, which is what the Greeks did. But there was a real logic there. Why would you cover up the beauty of the body in sport, which is, of course, a celebration of what the human body can achieve? This is really a way to remind ourselves of the Greeks' concern with the potential of humanity, the potential of the mind, and the potential of the body.
Taken that extra step to become even more ideal, more heroic, more noble than even the finest athlete.
It is a perfect form.
The counterpart of this idealization, right? That there seems to be this picture perfect, correct body, and that's still something that exists. You see that in lots of advertising and what sells, right? This idealization. Here, I like to really think that it's tied to just the health and athleticism, but in terms of art, how the body is used is how a story is being told, which is going to lead us into the next one.
Donatello was primarily a sculptor, a contemporary of Brunelleschi, who preceded Da Vinci and Vasari. His sculpture of David is a significant symbol of 15th century Florence, which was then a small mercantile city-state in Italy, gaining strength through business, art, and architecture, in contrast to Milan's autocracy. The Medici family commissioned the sculpture, representing their ability to stand against the neighboring powers through their cultivation of culture, ingenuity, and wealth. David's biblical story tells of a shepherd boy who would later become king. When his older brothers faced a giant they could not defeat, David simply said, "I can do it." Through confidence, intellect, and divine will, David slayed Goliath. In Donatello's sculpture, David appears physically delicate, standing naked in a somewhat effeminate pose, holding the giant's oversized sword. His foot rests atop the giant's severed head, contrasting David's nakedness with his fallen enemy's heavy armor. The figure embodies a triumph of cunning and determination through seemingly insurmountable odds. Florence thrived in the late 14th century, growing as a cultural center and gaining wealth through trade and innovative banking systems. As hubris and individualism flourished, as discussed in the context of Pico della Mirandola, a friar criticized the people's arrogance and corruption in Florence. He denounced the Medici's control over the Florentine Republic, claiming they led the people away from faith towards selfish indulgences. The Medici were eventually forced to relocate to Rome, though they returned a few years later. About 60 years after Donatello's David first stood in the Medici gardens, A 25-year-old Michelangelo completed his version in 1501. Having proven his mastery with the Pietà in Rome, Michelangelo was commissioned to create a massive sculpture for the Florence Cathedral. It was a triumphant return to his hometown and a challenge to Rome's authority. This context illuminates the difference between the two Davids. The Florentines viewed David as their symbol of the city's resistance against autocracies and the Medici's control, believing themselves to be stronger, smarter, and more artistically gifted. The two sculptures differ dramatically in scale and stature. Donatello's David stands at about 5 feet, while Michelangelo's towers at 17 feet tall. Unlike Donatello's delicate youth, Michelangelo's muscular David bears an imposing presence. Carved from a single block of Carrara marble, in contrast to Donatello's bronze casting, the figure displays an intense, willful gaze as he prepares to face Goliath. Michelangelo's David embodies the Renaissance humanist ideals in its freestanding marble sculpture, celebrating human beauty and potential.
The story didn't change, but how it was approached by the artist. So same young boy, not just in the fact that it was a 17-foot tall sculpture, it was a very muscular young boy, whereas the Donatello sculpture really does feel like it's a 12, 13-year-old boy. You don't get the feeling from that with Michelangelo's. The other part of it is in Donatello's, he has already slayed Goliath. And with the Michelangelo version, he's sort of peering out, looking at what could be done. It wasn't what was done. It's about looking into the future. So I think there's some interesting comparatives between the two, but also in the story carried by the different relationships of the physical form of how they're constructed. The other part of the story that I didn't tell here is that Michelangelo was very young. He was about 19 when he did the Pietà, and that was for a cardinal in Rome. And that was part of the story. The issue was that he was, as this great young sculptor, pulled off to Rome, where he was commissioned to do this sculpture for the cathedral. So one of the things that was happening, a lot of people think about, okay, so the Renaissance, there's a lot of investigation or re-investigations of anatomy and understanding how the body worked. But this is a really interesting part of the story, is that up until that point, that includes Da Vinci and Michelangelo, not very many, were able to do actual autopsies or dissections. A lot of people relied on this guy, Galen, who had written a book. This was 216 AD, so this was the standard anatomy book, but the majority of what his anatomical reports were based on, his dissecting animals, not humans, right? And a lot of the information that was in the book with all of the illustrations that were by far not correct. So a lot of it had to do with the blood vessels originating from the liver. The human mandible was in 2 parts, and this is my favorite, is that men had fewer ribs than women regarding the rib of Adam based. So that was part of what was written about in his book. So move that forward about literally 500 years, and this guy, Vesalius, was really the key development in looking at anatomy. Now, this is another really interesting thing, is that there is a separation between surgeons and doctors. Surgeons were, it's a funny, the barbers were surgeons, like the people who cut hair, because specifically at battle, when people needed to have a surgeon, they called the barber, because he had knives and knew how to use knives well. It was not something that was typically done in the study of medicine, how one cuts open a body. So it wasn't until Vesalius from Belgium, he studied medicine in Paris, where apparently in Northern Europe they were a little bit looser about the ability for people to work on cadavers, and as opposed to Rome, where they were forbidden because of religion. So he eventually, through some politics, was no longer staying in Paris and went to Padua in Italy, where he was able to start his own dissections of humans, specifically people that were executed. So the governor of that town agreed that it was important for us to understand how the human anatomy worked through this research. You can see I have cover of that book. A couple of interesting things about this image was one of the key differences in medicine beforehand, the doctors would never get their hands dirty. They would never actually cut, they would not do the dissection, they would always have something do that. So he was actually doing it, and then he would have somebody else documenting, writing everything that he saw and discovered and observations. But that led to this short examples of him doing these really fantastic illustrations, breaking down and articulating the human anatomy better than anyone had done before. And those errors of Galen that I just mentioned a minute ago, he figured out. The one thing that he didn't figure out was how the veins work. He got that wrong too. They couldn't figure out how arteries and veins work, which is the next video, which is fun, because that wasn't until William Harvey basically understood the way the circulatory system works. And I have a quick short video about Harvey.
In the olden days, dissecting a human body was prohibited under penalty of death. So, if it was illegal to observe what took place inside people's bodies, how was blood circulation discovered? In the 2nd century, Galen of Pergamon considered that there were two types of blood: venous blood, formed in the liver, which carried nutrients, and arterial blood, formed in the heart, which carried vital spirit. He believed blood was consumed by organs, so the heart and the liver had to constantly produce it. Over 1,000 years later, the physician Ibn al-Nafis discovered that blood travels from the heart to the lungs, although he thought that it had to mingle with air to create what he called animal spirit. Miguel Servet reached the same conclusions 300 years later. He wrote his description in a theological treatise, which led him to being burnt at stake for heresy, along with most of his books. These ideas didn't resurface until William Harvey started analysing serpents and fish before performing the ultimate experiment on humans. What? Don't you worry. He tied a tight bandage on somebody's arm, which cut off blood flow from the arteries and veins. The arm below the bandage became cool and pale, while above the bandage it was warm and swollen. When the bandage was loosened slightly, blood from the arteries came into the arm, since arteries are deeper in the flesh than veins. When this was done, the lower arm became warm and swollen. This led him to discover that blood travels in a double circular system. First, arteries provide the body with nutrients, and veins take blood back to the heart. Then, it's transported to the lungs to collect oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide, and it's ready to begin again. Thanks to his discovery, William Harvey went on to become the first person to describe the circulation system in its whole in one of the most influential books in the history of modern science.
I think this is just a little fun aside from the importance of these observational studies of the human anatomy, not only to be used in making nice sculptures and paintings, but also how that was a direct relationship to advancements in medicine. I think the other sort of part that I want to underscore there is what the role was of doctors, that they were not involved with doing surgery. They were not allowed to cut bodies apart. That was just, I think, really interesting. And then this is probably one of the more well-known paintings, this anatomy lesson.
In The Hague, We're looking at one of Rembrandt's most famous paintings. This is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp.
This is a typical group portrait, an important type of painting in the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. This happens to be the Guild of Surgeons, and regularly they would commission a group portrait to hang in the public space where their guild would meet.
Once a year, there would be a public dissection where some element of the body would be explicated, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, this is not true to life. In reality, this would have been a much more public event. It's very likely that the chief surgeon, in this case Dr. Tulp, would not have been performing the actual dissection, but would have had an assistant do this. But what's so remarkable here is that Rembrandt is reinventing the group portrait. Now, it's important to remember that Holland in the 17th century was largely a Protestant nation, and the church was no longer a major patron. And so artists looked to the professional and middle classes for patronage, and that's what we have here.
And the professional and middle classes and merchant classes looked to artists to create a new kind of art that would meet their needs. And in this case, the need to show off the profession of these men, and specifically in this case, the brilliance of Dr. Tulp.
I think it's hard to imagine that for so much of history prior to this painting, that as a culture we had so little understanding of the human body. We begin to reinvestigate it during the Renaissance, and then here in the Baroque era, we begin to impose a scientific investigation on the human body and understand it again.
Leonardo and Michelangelo dissected bodies pretty much in secret so they could understand how the body worked and represented in their paintings. But up in the north, in the Dutch Republic, doctors and artists were able to do this more openly. That book, At the Feet of the Cadaver, is a reminder of this renewed interest in human anatomy. They're dissecting a man who had just been hanged. He's a criminal.
Look at the way that Rembrandt has taken what was a genre of painting where men's faces were often simply a line, very much like a contemporary class portrait, which was meant to be a documentation, and he's created out of that not only a sense of individuality, but a sense of a shared moment.
A narrative, a story that unfolds. Each of these figures doing something slightly different, paying attention to slightly different things. And then you have this wonderful varied light, with the most light falling on the cadaver and on Dr. Tulp.
He's lifting up the tendons and exposing not only the forearm, but the hand as well. And it's a remarkable thing because you have not only the exposed mechanics of the human hand, but the intact hand of the doctor manipulating that exposed hand. And although we don't see it directly, the hand of the artist who is able to produce this painting with his own hand, which is here visible through his brushwork.
Through the paint. And I've always understood what Tulp was doing with his left hand as showing how those tendons would move the arm.
And Rembrandt has placed these figures in a pyramid, that is, they're almost stacked on top of each other, so that no face is hidden in part, and each figure is given a kind of prominence.
But that pyramid is off to the left, and so there's a real asymmetry, and Tulp stands alone on the right. That foreshortened cadaver coming into our space. It's a horrifying painting for us to look at. Although these may have been public events in the 17th century, these aren't things that we're used to seeing.
I'm interested in the fact that when we see dead bodies painted in the history of Western art, it is generally a representation of Christ. There are even examples where Christ is represented in this kind of foreshortened pose. You might think, for instance, of Dead Christ by Mantegna, but here science has replaced the spiritual, and it is really a reminder that the 17th century is a point where science really does come to the fore and begins to lay the foundation for the modern world.
We see Rembrandt bringing drama and bringing narrative and bringing storytelling to the group portrait. We saw this, for example, in The Night Watch, this amazing kind of animation and naturalism, removing the stiffness and uniformity of light that had been there in earlier group portraits.
And like the later Night Watch, Rembrandt focuses our attention in very specific places. Look, for example, at the way in which the entire lower left corner is virtually invisible. We can just make out the elbows, the drapes of the figures. We can just make out the chair, but we're not meant to focus there. Our eye is not meant to rest there, but our eye is drawn to the center. And of course, the most attention is given to the faces and then the attributes of the success of these figures. And that comes across very clearly in this starched white collars, which are painted with such meticulous skill and were a signal of the wealth of the sitters. Think about the effort that went into keeping those snow white and then ironing them and starching them so that they were just perfect. It's so clearly a Baroque painting. Look at the proximity of that body, the way in which we are part of the circle surrounding this body. There's of intimacy and directness that you'd never see in the Renaissance.
And that reality of that dead body, too. We don't have the tendency to idealize that we see in Renaissance painting, but that interest in reality and the mundane in day-to-day life, that's part of especially Dutch Baroque painting. Now, Rembrandt is 25 when he paints this, which is just astounding. At an age when most people would still be students, Rembrandt appears to be an accomplished artist. He had just recently moved to Amsterdam, and this painting launches his career as the most sought-after portrait painter in Amsterdam for a couple of decades to come.
Okay. So I just wanted to end with this. What is unique here, it's the appeal of this gory scene, but looking at the stark contrast between these figures that are sort of leaning in, listening to every word, watching every gesture of the doctor, but also by contrast to the very pale, cold corpse that's there. It sort of brings us in, which is something really unique and as a painting. It's typical Baroque, adding a lot of drama to this narrative, this story.